The retired doctor found me face down on the sidewalk 3 blocks from the house my ex-wife still lived in. He called 911, stayed beside me until the ambulance arrived, and later gave me one warning I couldn't shake. Paul, you need to stop walking past that house. 2 years earlier, Carol had taken the house, the children, and almost everything I believed my life was built around. I thought losing them was the worst thing that could happen to me. I was wrong. My name is Paul Foster. I'm 50 years old, and for the past 2 years I've lived alone in a 2-bedroom apartment on Spring Street in Charleston, South Carolina. Before that, I had spent 21 years in a 4-bedroom federal-style home on Rutledge Avenue with my wife, Carol, and our 2 children. I helped buy that house. I helped renovate it. I watched our children grow up there. Then our marriage collapsed, and so did the life I thought was permanent. Our divorce was finalized in January 2023. I was 47 and a senior partner at a civil litigation firm on Broad Street, a firm I had spent 25 years helping build. By the time the settlement was over, Carol kept the $890,000 house. I received $340,000 from my share of the firm partnership, and she ended up with primary influence over our children. Nora was 19 and firmly on her mother's side, convinced she knew exactly who was to blame. James was 16 and stayed neutral, calling me every other week from his bedroom at the Rutledge Avenue house like a diplomat trying to keep 2 countries from going to war. I moved into the apartment on Spring Street and tried to build a life around what was left, but some habits refused to die. For 20 years, I had walked the same streets through Charleston's Cannonboro neighborhood before the city fully woke up. So even after the divorce, my feet kept taking me past Rutledge Avenue. I never planned those walks. I never stopped to look at the house. I simply kept following the route my body knew better than my mind did. Then one Monday morning in March 2025, I passed the house again. I made it 3 blocks before something inside my chest suddenly went wrong. My heart began pounding in a rhythm that didn't feel like mine. I took another step, tried to breathe, and collapsed onto the sidewalk. Tom Grady found me. He was 70. A retired physician who lived 2 houses down from my old home. He had stepped outside to collect his newspaper when he saw me lying there. He called 911 before he even reached me. When I woke at Roper St. Francis Healthcare, an IV was running into my arm and Tom was sitting in the corner of the room reading a magazine. He looked up when he saw my eyes open. "You're back," I swallowed. "What happened?" "Cardiac event," he said. "Not a full infarction." He closed the magazine and leaned toward me. "Your cardiologist will explain the medical part. I'm more concerned about something else." I stared at him. "What?" Tom held my gaze for a moment. "Paul, you need to stop walking past that house." I almost laughed, but Tom wasn't smiling. And for the first time, I started wondering whether my old home on Rutledge Avenue had taken more from me than I realized. Carol's last words to me after the divorce settlement were delivered with a calmness that somehow hurt more than anger would have. She looked at me and said, "You build nothing that lasts, Paul. Not even this family." Then she smiled, not cruelly, almost proudly, like someone admiring the finished result of a plan that had gone exactly the way she wanted. I moved into the apartment on Spring Street with a few books, some clothes, my father's old watch, and a coffee maker. I left the family photographs behind. The frames belonged to the house, and I wasn't about to fight over picture frames. I told myself I'd replace them someday. I never did. 2 years later, the walls were still bare. Losing a marriage at 47 had taken more from me than the house, or the money, or even the distance from my children. It took away the version of myself who had believed that my life was stable. That man had lived in the Rutledge Avenue house, eaten dinner at that table, watched his children grow, and assumed there would always be a tomorrow that looked roughly like today. After the settlement, I carried what was left of him into a 2-bedroom apartment and tried to figure out who I was supposed to be. By 50, I was consulting part-time from a desk near the window, still taking the same morning walk through Charleston and still passing the life I used to have. Then my heart stopped cooperating. Dr. Linda Marsh, my cardiologist at Roper St. Francis, was 52, precise, and far too direct to waste time pretending something wasn't serious. She explained that I hadn't suffered a heart attack. I'd experienced an arrhythmia, an irregular heart rhythm that had triggered the collapse. It was a warning, and she wanted answers. Your biological family cardiac history, she said, looking over my intake form. You've listed it as unknown. I was adopted, I told her. My adoptive parents are both gone. I don't know anything about my biological family. She paused, made a note, and looked up. Then I'm referring you to cardiac genetics at MUSC. With an arrhythmia and no biological history, we need to rule out hereditary conditions. I agreed. After collapsing on a Charleston sidewalk, I wasn't exactly in a position to argue with medical advice. But Dr. Marsh didn't know something important. Neither did Carol, my children, or anyone else in my life except two men I trusted. At the top of the desk in my Spring Street apartment sat a locked drawer. Inside was a brown legal-size folder I had kept for 11 years. The file had nothing to do with my divorce, my heart, or the life I was living now. It went back to 2013, when I was 38 and cleaning out my adoptive mother Helen's house after her diagnosis. Helen Foster had been a retired school teacher and the most organized person I'd ever known. She kept every receipt, letter, medical record, and important document in labeled folders, sorted by year and category. I had always assumed my obsession with order came from growing up with her. I was about to discover that I had been wrong about that too. At the bottom of Helen's bureau, beneath old tax records, insurance papers, and Christmas card lists, dating back to 1971, I found a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Helen's handwriting. Underneath were 4 words, "When you are ready." I sat on the edge of her bed holding that envelope for several minutes before finally opening it. Inside was my original birth certificate. My biological mother was listed as Margaret Collins, 19 years old, from Charleston, South Carolina. The father's name was simply marked unknown. Beneath the birth certificate were adoption papers processed through a private Charleston attorney in November 1975. Then I found a handwritten note on plain white paper. The handwriting was small and careful, as if the woman writing it had been fighting to keep her hands steady. Paul, I hope you are well and happy, and that life has been kind to you. I could not keep you, and I have never stopped being sorry for it. Your father did not know about you until it was too late to matter. He was a good man in a complicated situation, and he spent a long time looking for you afterward. I hope someday you find each other. With love always, Margaret. I read it 4 times. Then I folded it back up and stared at the envelope. For 38 years, I had believed my adoption was the beginning of my story. Now I knew it had only been the beginning of a story someone had kept from me. The following year, I hired Dale Hooper, a former Charleston police detective who had become a private investigator. I gave him the birth certificate, Margaret's note, and 3 weeks. He needed 11 days. I found him, Dale told me. His name was Edward Harlow. Edward Harlow was the founder of Harlow Maritime Holdings, a Charleston-based shipping and logistics company that had grown into a regional powerhouse. He was 73, a widower, and lived in a large house in the South of Broad neighborhood. Dale's investigation uncovered something even more difficult to process. Edward had apparently spent years trying to locate a child who had been placed for adoption in Charleston in November 1975. That child was me. He had never found me. He had no other children. I read Dale's report twice and stared at the phone number he had found for Edward's office. One call could change everything. I never made it. I was 39, married, raising 2 children, and running a career I had built from the ground up. My entire identity had been shaped around the people I loved and the life I had created. Calling a 73-year-old stranger and telling him I was the son he had spent decades looking for felt like tearing open a wall without knowing what was behind it. So I put the file away. I told myself I would call when the timing was right. The timing never came. Years passed. My marriage changed. My children grew older. Work consumed more of my life. And eventually, the file became one more thing I had learned to live beside without touching. Then Carol left me with the house, the divorce settlement, and those 4 words that stayed with me long after she walked away. You build nothing that lasts. She had no idea how wrong she was. Because 11 years after I first found that file, lying in a hospital bed after my heart suddenly betrayed me, I finally had a reason to open it again. Helen died in 2016. My adoptive father, Richard, had been gone since 2009. The file stayed where I had left it, buried in the drawer of my desk. Then, in March 2020, Edward Harlow died at 79. I saw his obituary in the Post and Courier one Tuesday morning while I was drinking coffee. I read it twice and made one decision. I did nothing. The obituary said his estate would be handled by the board of Harlow Maritime while his final testamentary instructions were reviewed. I already knew what that meant. Years earlier, Dale had discovered a provision in Edward's will that I had never been able to forget. His biological heir could inherit the estate, but only after DNA verification. If no heir was identified, the fortune would eventually be transferred to charitable trusts. The deadline was 5 years from Edward's death, March 2025. The same month I collapsed on a Charleston sidewalk. The same month Dr. Marsh sent me to MUSC. And when I walked into MUSC's cardiac genetics program, I had no idea that the clock on Edward Harlow's estate had only 12 days left. Dr. Kevin Walsh was the genetic counselor assigned to my case. He was 44, methodical, and spoke with the careful precision of someone accustomed to delivering information that could change a person's life. 10 days after my collapse, I sat across from him in his office on Ashley Avenue while he reviewed my screening results. He placed a folder on the desk between us. "Mr. Foster, your screening flagged a hereditary arrhythmia marker, a KCNQ1 gene variant." I looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It's associated with long QT syndrome. It affects the heart's electrical system and can cause the kind of episode you experienced." He paused. "It also matters because this condition can be inherited. We normally look at family history and determine whether relatives should be screened." "I was adopted." "I know." He turned another page. "That's why I ran your profile through our research database." Then he stopped. The pause lasted just long enough for me to notice it. "Mr. Foster, our database contains genetic profiles contributed by participants in hereditary cardiac research since 2018. He looked directly at me. "One of those participants was Edward Harlow." My stomach tightened. "Edward Harlow?" "He participated because he carried the same KCNQ1 variant." "Doctor," Walsh slid the folder slightly closer to me. "His genetic profile matches yours at a level consistent with a first-degree biological relative." I stared at him. How close? He didn't hesitate. Parent and child. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he asked, "You know Mr. Harlow?" I looked down at the name printed on the page. "I have a file on him at home." Dr. Walsh frowned slightly. "What kind of file?" "I've had it for 11 years. The room went quiet. Then I remembered the other part of Edward's story, the part that had been sitting untouched in my desk drawer for years. His will required DNA verification for any biological heir, and the 5-year deadline was almost over. "How long?" I asked. "Doctor," Walsh checked the date. "Approximately 12 days. I stood up. "Then I need to call my attorney." Frank Calhoun had represented me for 22 years. His office was on Broad Street, inside a building that had been a law office for most of its history. Frank was 65, meticulous, and had practiced long enough to be difficult to surprise. I called him from the MUSC parking lot. "Frank," I said when he answered, "I think I just found my biological father." He was silent for a beat. Then he asked, "Paul? Who?" "Edward Harlow." Another silence. "The Edward Harlow?" "Yes." "The one who died 5 years ago?" "Yes." Frank exhaled slowly. "Paul, tell me exactly what happened." I looked back at the MUSC building. "I think I'm his son, and if I'm right, we have 12 days to prove it." "Frank, I need to see you today." I was standing in the MUSC parking lot when I made the call. "I have a 4 o'clock. "How urgent is this?" I took a breath. "There's a DNA-verified inheritance tied to a 5-year estate deadline. It expires in 12 days. Edward Harlow's estate is worth roughly $47 million. I've known since 2014 that he may have been my biological father, and I never acted on it." The line went quiet. Frank Calhoun was rarely silent for long. "Paul," he finally said, "come in at 2. I'm moving my 4 o'clock. When I arrived at his office, Frank was already pulling documents from a case database. Before we went any further, I needed to understand the one question that could change everything. If I inherited $47 million, could Carol claim a piece of it? In 2014, when Dale Hooper first identified Edward Harlow as my biological father, I was married with 2 children, a career I had built from scratch, and no desire to blow up my life chasing a man I had never known. The file went into a drawer because I chose to put it there. I had no inheritance at that point. I had no guaranteed claim. I had a possibility that depended on proving a biological relationship and taking action I had deliberately refused to take. Frank leaned back in his chair. "Here's the important part," he said. "A contingent future interest isn't an asset." I knew what he meant. I had practiced South Carolina civil law for 25 years. The provision in Harlow's will created the possibility of an inheritance, not an inheritance itself. Until the required conditions were satisfied, there was nothing to divide, sell, or value. Carol's attorneys had received my financial disclosures during the divorce. They contained every actual asset I owned at the time. The folder in my desk was not an asset. It was evidence that a possibility existed. Frank had already reached the same conclusion. "Your exposure is minimal," he said. Then he added, "But it isn't zero." I looked at him. What could they argue? That you knew about a potential inheritance and had a duty to disclose it. And our response? You spent 11 years refusing to pursue it. We argue there was no present marital asset. South Carolina law is on our side. I nodded. What do we do first? Frank closed the file. We contact the Harlow estate attorneys. Today. He checked the calendar. You have 11 days. The Harlow estate had been handled since Edward's death by Robert Keene, an attorney whose firm was on Meeting Street in Charleston. Frank called him while I sat across the desk. The conversation was short and professional. By the time Frank hung up, we had an appointment for the next morning at MUSC to begin the DNA verification process using the genetic profile Edward had contributed to the cardiac research program. For the first time in 11 years, the file in my desk drawer was no longer just a secret from my past. It was a claim with a deadline. The formal comparison took 48 hours. When the result came back, the probability of biological paternity was 99.8%. Edward Harlow was my father. There was no longer a question about that. Frank filed the verification with the Harlow estate on the 2nd of April 2025, 9 days before the 5-year deadline expired. I thought the hardest part was over. I was wrong. The moment the estate accepted the DNA verification, the fight I had spent 11 years avoiding finally began. The Harlow estate was worth approximately $47 million, including company equity, real estate, and investment accounts. Once the DNA verification was accepted, the estate passed to me as Edward Harlow's sole biological heir. When Frank called to confirm it, I expected to feel relief, maybe even victory. Instead, I felt something I couldn't quite name. For 11 years, I had kept a door closed because I was afraid of what might be behind it. Now that door was wide open, and I wasn't sure whether I had finally found what I needed or simply uncovered everything I had spent years avoiding. Edward had been 79 when he died. According to Robert Keene, the estate attorney who had known him personally, Edward had spent decades quietly searching for the son he had lost. In 2018, he joined MUSC's cardiac research database and contributed his genetic profile. His participation was partly connected to his own heart condition, but there was another reason. Edward had hoped that if his son ever entered a medical system connected to that database, something might finally bring them together. He had used the only door available to him. I had walked through it 11 years too late. I kept thinking about that. I still do. Then Carol found out. I don't know exactly how she learned about the inheritance, but Charleston has a small professional world, and a $47 million estate involving a prominent local family and a well-known attorney doesn't stay quiet for long. By the second week of May, about 6 weeks after my DNA verification was filed, Frank called me into his office. He had received an emergency motion from Carol's attorney. I read the first page and immediately understood what they were after. They claimed I had known about a potential inheritance during our divorce and deliberately concealed it. They wanted the family court to reopen the settlement and award Carol a portion of the Harlow estate, the share she claimed she would have received if I had disclosed the inheritance before the divorce was finalized. I finished reading and placed the motion on Frank's desk. He watched me carefully. "How do you want to handle this?" he asked. "I want to win," I said, cleanly. Frank nodded. "Then let me show you why we will." His argument was simple. Carol could not divide something that did not exist as a marital asset when we settled the divorce. The Harlow inheritance had been contingent on several conditions, including my decision to identify myself, submit to DNA verification, and make the claim. Until I took those steps, I did not own $47 million. I owned a file containing information about a possibility. Carol's attorneys argued that I had known about Edward Harlow and deliberately hidden that knowledge. Frank's response was direct. Paul knew about a file. He knew about a potential biological connection. He made a deliberate decision for 11 years not to pursue it. That decision belonged to him. He looked at me across the desk. Knowing that something might exist is not the same as owning it. For the first time since Carol filed the motion, I felt the ground beneath me steady. But Frank wasn't finished. There's one more thing, he said. They're going to make this personal. I looked at him. How personal? Frank pushed the motion back toward me. They're going to argue that you didn't just hide an asset. They're going to argue you intentionally kept your biological identity secret from your wife. He paused. And if they can convince the judge of that, this stops being just a property dispute. Frank's response cited 3 South Carolina appellate decisions that directly supported our position. He also attached a detailed timeline covering every action I had taken, and every decision I had deliberately avoided from the moment Dale found Edward in 2014, through the divorce settlement, and finally my collapse in March 2025. There was no speculation in it, just dates, documents, and facts. The hearing took place in Charleston Family Court on the 3rd of June 2025. Carol's attorney argued for 40 minutes. Frank responded with the law. Then the judge ruled from the bench. The Harlow estate belongs entirely to Paul Foster. Carol's claim, the judge said, had no legal basis under established South Carolina law. Her motion was denied with prejudice. It was over. Frank and I walked out of the courthouse onto Broad Street. The June air was warm and heavy with salt from the harbor. At the courthouse steps, Frank held out his hand. Clean. I shook it. Clean. For the first time in years, I had won something without having to destroy someone else to get it. But standing there, I knew the money wasn't what mattered most. I knew exactly where I wanted it to go. My adoptive mother was Helen Foster. She had spent 31 years teaching 4th grade in the Charleston County School District and believed every child deserved someone willing to keep showing up for them. She died in 2016 at 71. After a short illness, she refused to make into a family emergency. Helen was the most organized person I had ever known, and one of the most quietly generous. She was also the woman who had left me the envelope that changed everything. She had known my entire life that one day I might want answers about where I came from. She never forced those answers on me. She simply kept them safe until I was ready. After the court ruling, I kept thinking about something Carol had said during our divorce. You build nothing that lasts. She had been wrong. Helen had built something that lasted. She had built me. Not with money, but with 38 years of patience, discipline, and love. Edward had built something too. His company, his fortune, and even the genetic database entry he had made years after I disappeared into the world. He had left behind a door without knowing whether I would ever find it. In June, I decided what I would do with what both of them had left me. I met with the dean of Charleston School of Law and established an endowment for a new civil justice professorship. I named it the Helen Foster Chair in Civil Justice, not after Edward Harlow, whose money funded it. After Helen, the woman who raised me. The chair would support research and teaching in civil litigation and expand access to legal resources for people who could not easily afford them. It was the same kind of law I had spent 25 years practicing, and the same field Helen had quietly pushed me toward from the beginning. She drove me to campus visits. She helped me with my applications. She sat in the gallery when I was admitted to the South Carolina bar. Every step I had taken toward becoming a lawyer had started with her. When the Post and Courier published the announcement in June, it included my full name, my photograph, and the amount of the endowment. Frank had advised me to keep a lower profile. I considered it. Then I thought about Helen's envelope sitting in that bureau all those years. She had never asked me to hide who I was. She had simply waited until I was ready to know. So I let the story run. I thought about Carol's words from the day our divorce became final. You build nothing that lasts. Then I decided I was done, living as if she had been right. The announcement ran on a Monday. Carol called 2 days later. I was sitting at the same desk on Spring Street where I had kept the brown folder for 11 years when her name appeared on my phone. I answered because we had 2 children, and whatever had happened between us, she was still their mother. Paul. Her voice sounded different. There was no satisfaction in it now. I saw the announcement, she said. I imagine you did. She hesitated. How long have you known about the inheritance? Since 2014. Silence. 11 years? Yes. And you never claimed it? I wasn't ready. I paused. Then the timing never seemed right. Then he died. Then we divorced. And eventually, my heart forced the issue. I told her about the genetic counselor at MUSC and how the connection that had existed for years finally brought everything together. She was quiet again. Then she asked, "The chair. You named it after your mother." "Helen?" I said. "Yes." "Not after him?" "No." "Why?" I already knew the answer. I just wanted to say it carefully, because what Helen gave me is what made it possible for me to use what Edward left me. She gave me the discipline to build a career. She taught me how to practice law honestly. She gave me the stability to raise my children. I took a breath. Edward Harlow left me money. Helen Foster left me something that lasts. Carol said nothing for several seconds. Then she spoke more quietly. "I'm not calling to reopen the settlement." "Good," I said. "The court ruled." "That's finished." "I know." Another pause. "I said something to you during the settlement about you not building anything that lasts. I remember. I meant it at the time." "I know." Her voice dropped. "I'm not sure I meant it the way it sounded." I leaned back in my chair. There was a difference between what people intend to say and what they leave behind when the words are gone. "Carol," I said, "I built 25 years of a legal career. I built a relationship with our children that survived the divorce. And I built a life in a 2-bedroom apartment that was still enough for a neighbor to recognize when something was wrong and call for help before he even reached me." I paused. "What lasts isn't always what you can put a number on." She didn't answer. After a moment, I asked, "How are Nora and James?" Her voice changed when she answered. "Nora wants to call you. She's been working through some things since the announcement. She knows where to find me. And James asked if he can come down from Clemson this weekend." I smiled for the first time during that conversation. "I'll make dinner. Tell him Saturday." We ended the call without pretending everything was suddenly fixed. There was no apology that erased 2 years. No perfect reconciliation, no convenient ending. Just 2 people who had lived through something painful and were finally speaking without the bitterness that had once filled every silence. I didn't know whether the family we had been could ever exist again, but for the first time, I was willing to find out. And there was something else I had learned through all of this. Adoption had taught me that biology can answer where you came from without deciding who you become. The man whose blood I carried had left me a fortune. The woman who raised me had left me the person capable of deciding what to do with it. And in the end, that distinction mattered more than the money. For many adoptees, the absence of biological family history is more than an unanswered question. It can become a medical problem. In my case, not knowing my biological cardiac history meant there was no obvious warning that I carried a hereditary arrhythmia. Long QT syndrome, the condition linked to my KCNQ1 variant, is often inherited and can affect the heart's electrical system without announcing itself until something goes wrong. That is why biological medical history matters. It can influence diagnosis, treatment, and whether biological children should be screened. If you were adopted and experience an unexplained cardiac event, ask your doctor whether hereditary arrhythmia testing or a cardiac genetics evaluation makes sense. The other lesson from my story is legal, and it is one I wish more people understood before signing a divorce settlement. A contingent future interest is not automatically a marital asset. If an inheritance depends on conditions that have not yet been satisfied, the inheritance may not have a present value at all. In my case, Edward's will required DNA verification and a decision on my part to pursue the claim. Until I took those steps, the $47 million estate was not mine. I had a folder. I had research. I had a possibility. I did not have $47 million. That distinction became the center of Carol's case against me, and Frank's response relied on 3 South Carolina appellate decisions supporting our position. If you are going through a divorce and you have an inheritance, business interest, potential claim, or any other financial possibility that depends on future conditions, do not assume you know how the law treats it. Ask your attorney before you sign anything. But there was one part of this story no attorney could resolve for me. I had known about Edward since 2014. I had found the man who was apparently my biological father and then chosen not to call him. I made that decision knowingly. I had a family, a career, and a life I wasn't prepared to tear apart for someone I had never met. I don't regret making that choice with the information I had at the time, but I also won't pretend it cost me nothing. Edward spent years looking for a son he never found. In 2018, he gave his DNA to a medical research program, partly for his own health and partly because he still hoped that somewhere, somehow, the system might lead him to me. He died without knowing that I had already found him. That is something I will carry for the rest of my life. I can't change what I did then. I can only decide what I do with it now. That is why the Helen Foster Chair in Civil Justice exists. The endowment will support a professorship at Charleston School of Law, focused on civil procedure and access to justice, the kind of work that helps ordinary people navigate a legal system that can feel impossible when you don't have money or experience on your side. Helen would have understood that immediately. She spent her life believing that people were worth helping even when there was nothing in it for her. And then James came to dinner. He was 19, a freshman at Clemson, and I hadn't seen him since Thanksgiving. He looked older than I remembered, taller too, and somehow more certain of himself. He ate 3 servings of the shrimp and grits I had spent 4 years trying to perfect, and talked nonstop about his computer science classes. I sat across from him and listened. For 2 years, I had been afraid that losing my family meant I would never get another chance to be part of their lives. That night, I realized I had been looking at the wrong door. The house on Rutledge Avenue was gone. The marriage was gone. Edward was gone. But James was sitting across from me, asking for more shrimp and grits and telling me about his future. And for the first time in a long time, I stopped measuring my life by what I had lost. At the end of dinner, James stood by the door and looked around my apartment. His eyes moved over the bare walls, the empty spaces where photographs should have been. "You should put some pictures up, Dad." I smiled. "I've been meaning to. I could help." He glanced back at me. "Next weekend?" Then he added, almost casually, "Nora said she might come too." For a second, I couldn't answer. I thought about Helen's envelope, Margaret's handwritten note, Edward putting his DNA into that database in 2018, still hoping that somehow his son might find him. And now, after all those years, my children were talking about coming back to my apartment. "Next weekend," I said. "I'll get the frames." James hugged me before he left. It was a little awkward, the way hugs can be when a 19-year-old is trying to rebuild something he thought was gone. I stood in the doorway and watched him disappear down the stairs. The walls were still bare, but not for much longer. Carol once told me, I built nothing that lasted. She was thinking about the house on Rutledge Avenue, the money, the career, and all the visible things people use to measure a successful life. She was right about one thing. Those things can disappear. Houses change hands, money moves, careers end, but she was wrong about what lasts. Helen Foster's name now lives on at Charleston School of Law, attached to a chair that will continue helping people long after I'm gone. My 2 children, after years of distance, were finding their way back to me. And the file that sat untouched in a drawer for 11 years had been waiting for the exact moment when my life was finally ready for it. One ordinary walk past an old house led to a collapse. The collapse led to a genetic test. The test led to Edward Harlow. And Edward led me to a part of myself I had spent years avoiding. I used to think that building something meant making it permanent. Now I think it means creating something that continues to matter after you are no longer there to protect it. I am Paul Foster. I'm 50 years old, a former senior litigation partner, a part-time consultant, a father of 2, and the sole heir to the Harlow estate. But those titles are not the part of my story I'm proudest of. For the first time in my life, I'm not looking backward at the house I lost. I'm looking at the people who are still here, and for the first time, I'm ready for what comes next.